The moment I realized my husband had taken everything was not in a courtroom, and it was not when the judge spoke my name without looking at me, and it was not even when I saw his lawyer smile like the outcome had been obvious all along. It was when I tried to swipe my card at the grocery store, and the machine beeped once, sharply, and the cashier said, without any drama at all, "I'm sorry, ma'am, it's been declined." I laughed, because that's what you do when something is so absurd it can't possibly be real, and I said, "That's impossible," while already knowing it wasn't, and I tried again, and then my phone buzzed in my coat pocket with a notification from my bank that used words like account restricted and court order and no available funds, and suddenly the cart in front of me felt obscene, filled with things I could no longer afford despite having been married for 16 years. I stepped aside so the line could move, my face burning, and that was when another notification came through, this one from my lawyer, sent an hour earlier while I was driving, a message I hadn't seen yet because I was still naive enough to believe I had a safety net. The judge approved Daniel's motion. All marital assets awarded to him pending appeal. You need to vacate the house immediately. Vacate the house. I stood there holding my phone, the grocery store lights humming overhead, and I understood something with terrifying clarity. My husband had not just divorced me. He had erased me. My name was off the accounts. My access was gone. The house was no longer mine. Even the car I was sitting in was registered to his company. By the time I drove home, shaking so badly I had to pull over twice, the locks had already been changed. A single suitcase I didn't recognize sat on the porch with my clothes stuffed inside like afterthoughts, and taped to the door was a copy of the court order, highlighted in yellow, as if someone wanted to be sure I didn't miss the part where my life had officially been reassigned. Daniel didn't come outside. He didn't have to. I sat in the car until the sun went down, reading the document again and again, trying to understand how a man I trusted could legally take my home, my savings, my future, and call it a fair settlement. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because this didn't start with a judge or a frozen account or a locked door. It started months earlier when my husband decided I wouldn't fight back, and made sure I couldn't. After that night in the car, after I finally accepted that the house was no longer mine, and that sleeping there would turn into a police issue instead of a marital one, I did what women like me are taught to do when things fall apart quietly. I tried to be reasonable, I tried to cooperate, and I tried to believe that fairness would eventually correct itself if I stayed calm long enough. I stayed with my sister at first, on her pull-out couch, surrounded by other people's routines and other people's noise, pretending this was temporary, pretending I still belonged somewhere. And every morning I woke up early so I wouldn't have to explain why I was already crying before breakfast. I called my lawyer, left messages, waited for responses that came hours later and sounded clipped and tired, and I told myself that delays were normal, that the legal system moved slowly, that this was just an uncomfortable middle before balance returned. But balance never returned. Instead, every day removed another layer of support I hadn't realized I was standing on. The first escalation came when I tried to access my email and found that my password no longer worked, not just on the shared family account but on my personal one too, the one I had used for years, the one that held tax records, insurance documents, correspondence with schools and doctors, and I remember staring at the login screen thinking there had to be a mistake until it occurred to me that Daniel had been the one who set up the recovery email years earlier, for convenience. A small decision I hadn't questioned because marriage teaches you to confuse trust with efficiency. When I finally reached my lawyer that afternoon, her voice was careful in a way that immediately put me on edge, and she explained that Daniel's attorney had filed an emergency motion alleging financial instability on my part, painting me as impulsive, irresponsible, and emotionally volatile, and that while she didn't agree with the characterization, the judge had accepted it provisionally, which meant that my access to accounts, records, and even some communications would be restricted, for now. For now, she said, as if time itself were neutral. I asked her how this could happen without my consent, how a narrative I didn't recognize could suddenly become legal truth, and she reminded me, gently but firmly, that Daniel controlled the documentation, that he had already submitted financial summaries, affidavits, and statements I hadn't seen yet, and that because I no longer had access to records, responding would take longer. That was when I understood the shape of what he was doing. He wasn't just taking assets, he was controlling time. Every delay weakened me. Every unanswered question made me look less credible. Every day without resources made it harder to fight. The second escalation came through silence. Friends I expected to hear from didn't call. Invitations stopped. Messages went unanswered. At first, I assumed people were giving me space, being respectful, but then I overheard my sister on the phone one evening, her voice low, saying my name followed by the words, "It's complicated," and something cold slid into place inside me. I asked her later what people were saying, and she hesitated too long before telling me that Daniel had been very open about the divorce, that he'd framed it as a tragic but necessary separation from a woman who had lost direction, that he'd expressed concern about my mental health, my decision-making, my ability to move forward constructively, and that because he sounded calm and wounded and cooperative, people believed him. He wasn't attacking me. He was diagnosing me. The third escalation came when I tried to see my son and learned that temporary scheduling adjustments had already been implemented, adjustments I hadn't agreed to, but that were justified by the same narrative, the one where I was unstable and Daniel was the parent providing consistency. I was still allowed to see him, of course, but now it was supervised by structure, by rules, by logistics that required transportation I didn't always have, and flexibility I couldn't afford. When my son looked at me across the table during one of those visits, his face careful and guarded in a way it had never been before, I felt something break that had nothing to do with money. I asked my lawyer what we could do, and she told me the truth I hadn't wanted to hear, which was that Daniel had prepared for this long before I knew there was a war, that he had documented everything, curated impressions, positioned himself as the reasonable party, and that until we could access financial discovery, until we could see what he had submitted, we were fighting blind. Discovery. That word again. The same one Daniel had been so eager for me to waive. I remembered the grocery store, the locked door, the suitcase on the porch, and for the first time since this began, I stopped thinking of this as a divorce and started thinking of it as a strategy. Late one night, unable to sleep on the unfamiliar couch, I pulled out the few papers I'd managed to grab from the house before being locked out. Old tax returns, partial statements, notes I'd kept over the years because I liked knowing where money went even when I wasn't the one earning it, and I spread them across the coffee table like fragments of a map. That was when I noticed something I hadn't questioned before because it had always been framed as normal business complexity. In the year Daniel claimed his income had dipped, the year he insisted we tighten spending, the year he said bonuses were uncertain, there were deposits that didn't match the story, transfers labeled vaguely, amounts that appeared briefly and vanished again, moving through accounts I didn't recognize. I couldn't see the full picture, but I could see the pattern, and patterns don't lie, even when people do. I tried to bring this up with my lawyer the next day, and she told me she'd suspected as much, that Daniel's filings were oddly clean, almost too simple, as if complexity had been intentionally relocated elsewhere. But suspicion wasn't proof, and proof required access, and access required time and money. Two things Daniel had made sure I lacked. Then came the call from his lawyer. It was framed as concern. It was delivered as pressure. They suggested mediation again, emphasized the cost of prolonged litigation, reminded me that Daniel was being generous with support, and hinted, carefully, that continued resistance could impact custody arrangements, not as a threat, of course, but as an unfortunate consequence of conflict. I hung up the phone and sat very still, because that was the moment I understood the depth of his confidence. He truly believed I would fold. He believed exhaustion would finish what paperwork started. What he didn't know was that something had shifted. Because when everything is taken from you at once, you stop worrying about preserving comfort, and you start focusing on truth, and truth has a way of surfacing even when it's been buried carefully. I didn't yet know how I would expose what Daniel was hiding. I didn't know who I could trust. I didn't know how long this would take. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no longer about salvaging a marriage or negotiating a settlement. This was about reclaiming reality from a man who had rewritten it. And somewhere inside the documents he thought I'd never see, the truth was already waiting. The person who cracked everything open was not a lawyer, and not a friend, and not anyone Daniel would have considered a threat, which in retrospect was the mistake that made all the others possible. It was a woman named Margaret Lewis, and I only remembered her because she once sent a handwritten thank you note after a dinner party I barely recalled hosting. A small, old-fashioned gesture that stood out in a life that had otherwise been optimized for efficiency. Margaret had worked as an internal compliance consultant for Daniel's company years earlier, back when the business was still growing and he still pretended to value transparency. And when she called me late one afternoon, her voice cautious and low, my first instinct was to assume it was another well-meaning check-in that would lead nowhere. But she didn't ask how I was doing, and she didn't offer sympathy, and she didn't speak in the careful, vague language people use when they're afraid of choosing sides. She said my name, paused, and then said, "I'm not sure if you remember me, but I need you to listen very carefully, because I don't have long, and I won't repeat this." I sat down before she even finished the sentence. Margaret told me she had seen Daniel's filings, not directly, but through a professional back channel that still existed, because corporate records have a way of resurfacing when people assume they've been buried permanently. She told me that his reported income was technically accurate only if you ignored where the money was actually going, that there were entities connected to his firm that never appeared on household disclosures, that profits were being routed through consulting shells and deferred compensation vehicles that delayed visibility long enough to become legally convenient. She spoke calmly, precisely, the way someone does when they've already wrestled with their conscience and made a decision. And when she said, "He's not hiding money from the court exactly, he's hiding it from time," I felt something inside me align for the first time since the locks were changed. I asked her why she was telling me this, and there was a brief silence before she answered. "Because he asked me to sign off on something years ago that didn't sit right, and I refused, and I've watched him benefit from that refusal ever since, and because when I heard what he did to you, I realized he was using the same playbook, just more aggressively." Margaret didn't have documents yet. What she had was direction, names, dates, a roadmap of where to look if I could ever get access. She warned me that confronting Daniel directly would only accelerate his efforts, that he would move assets again if he sensed exposure, and that patience mattered more than urgency now. That word again. Patience. The loss that followed came quickly, as if Daniel sensed something shifting, even before I did. My lawyer called to tell me he had filed another motion, this one seeking to formalize the temporary orders into something more permanent, citing my failure to stabilize housing and income, and when I asked how I was supposed to stabilize anything without access to funds, she didn't answer right away. which told me everything. I lost the apartment I'd been in the process of renting because my frozen accounts made me look unreliable. I lost time with my son when Daniel cited scheduling conflicts and logistical concerns that sounded reasonable on paper. I lost the illusion that fairness would appear if I waited quietly. What I did not lose was information. Margaret connected me with a forensic accountant she trusted, a man who spoke rarely and asked questions that made me uncomfortable because they assumed Daniel was far more calculated than I had ever allowed myself to believe. He explained that people like my husband didn't panic when confronted. They repositioned. They needed to be boxed in slowly with facts that could not be explained away as misunderstandings. The turning point came one evening when the accountant called and told me he had found a discrepancy Daniel couldn't talk his way out of, a deferred compensation account tied to an offshore structure that had been activated the same month Daniel claimed his income had declined, an account that paid out automatically upon material life changes, including divorce, and suddenly the strategy made brutal sense. Daniel wasn't just taking everything because he could. He was taking everything because the divorce itself triggered his payout. My displacement was not collateral damage. It was the mechanism. I sat with that knowledge for a long time, long enough for the anger to burn itself down into something colder and more durable. And when my lawyer asked if I wanted to push for immediate discovery now that we had cause, I surprised her by saying no, not yet. Because Daniel was arrogant, and arrogance creates openings, and the more comfortable he felt, the more careless he would become. I agreed to mediation again. I appeared cooperative. I stopped pushing publicly. I let him believe exhaustion had finally won. And somewhere deep inside his own paperwork, the evidence continued to accumulate, waiting for the moment when facts, not emotion, would finally speak. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, deliberately early, because Daniel preferred decisions made before people had time to second-guess themselves, and when I walked into the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I was confident of victory, but because I was finally standing on solid ground, the kind built from documents instead of hope. Daniel was already there, of course. He always arrived early. He sat at the table with his attorney, jacket off, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest cooperation, and when he looked up and saw me, he smiled with that familiar, faintly indulgent expression, the one that said he believed this was nearly over. He nodded once, politely, as if we were colleagues concluding a project rather than former spouses dismantling a shared life. I took my seat beside my lawyer and placed my folder on the table, carefully, deliberately, because every movement in that room would be read as character evidence, and I wanted my calm to be unmistakable. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. The process began. Daniel's attorney spoke first, outlining the same narrative that had already served them well, emphasizing stability, responsibility, cooperation, and concern, repeating phrases like temporary hardship and reasonable support, and presenting Daniel as a man who had done everything possible to minimize conflict while protecting assets for the sake of consistency. It was a well-practiced story, clean and controlled, and I watched the judge nod along, not in agreement exactly, but in recognition, because this was a story the system understood. When it was my lawyer's turn, she didn't raise her voice, and she didn't challenge the tone, and she didn't argue about feelings. She asked for discovery. Daniel's attorney objected immediately, citing prior agreements, the waiver they believed I would still sign, the cost and burden of expanded investigation, and as he spoke, I watched Daniel lean back slightly in his chair, relaxed, confident, already imagining the judge agreeing, already picturing the end of this, with his accounts intact and his story preserved. The judge looked at my lawyer, then at me, and asked if I had grounds for the request. I nodded once. My lawyer stood and began to speak, and this time the room shifted, subtly but unmistakably, because she wasn't speculating, and she wasn't accusing, she was presenting facts, dates, structures, patterns, explaining how reported income and actual benefit could diverge legally while still misleading materially, explaining how deferred compensation triggered by life events could be omitted from initial disclosures without technically violating procedure. And as she spoke, I watched Daniel's posture change, just slightly, the way it does when someone recognizes a word they hoped would never be said out loud. The judge asked for clarification. My lawyer provided it. The judge asked if there was documentation. My lawyer opened the folder I had carried in and slid copies across the table, not the full picture yet, just enough to justify the question, just enough to show that something existed beyond what had been disclosed. Daniel's attorney objected again, more sharply this time, arguing relevance, arguing interpretation, arguing that these were speculative inferences, and the judge listened, patiently, before turning to Daniel and asking him directly to explain the discrepancy. That was the moment I will remember for the rest of my life, because it was the first time since this began that Daniel did not answer immediately. He hesitated, only for a second, but that second mattered. He spoke then, calmly, carefully, choosing words the way he always did, framing the structures as standard practice, emphasizing legality, minimizing impact, and for a brief moment I thought it might work, because confidence carries weight in rooms like that. Then the judge asked a follow-up question, and then another, and then asked why these entities had not been disclosed in the initial filings if they were so standard, and then asked whether the activation date coincided with the filing of divorce proceedings. Daniel looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the paperwork again. Silence stretched, thin and tense, and I realized something important was happening, something irreversible, because the story Daniel had been telling relied on uninterrupted flow, and now it had been paused. The judge ordered full discovery, not partial, not delayed. Full. Daniel's jaw tightened, just for a moment, but I saw it. The ruling continued, addressing temporary support, access to funds, restoration of account privileges pending review, and for the first time since the locks were changed, I heard my name spoken in a way that did not sound like a liability. When we left the courtroom, Daniel did not speak to me. He didn't smile. He walked ahead, phone already in his hand, already recalculating, and I understood then that the fight was not over, but the balance had shifted. Everything seemed lost for so long because I was playing a game where the rules were hidden. Now they were on the table. And Daniel, for the first time, was no longer controlling the clock. The end did not arrive with applause or outrage, or a single, satisfying moment where everything snapped cleanly into place, because real endings rarely do. It came in pieces, spread across weeks of filings, amended disclosures, quiet phone calls between attorneys, and the slow unraveling of a narrative that could not survive sustained light. Once discovery began, Daniel stopped speaking to me entirely. All communication moved through lawyers, formal and precise, stripped of the paternal concern and measured sympathy he had once performed so well, and I learned more about him during that silence than I ever had during our marriage. Documents revealed what Margaret had warned me about, not one hidden account, but a network of them, deferred compensation, consulting entities, and structured payouts timed carefully around life events. And the divorce, it turned out, had not been an unfortunate disruption to his finances, but a calculated trigger. The house I had been locked out of was no longer just a home in dispute. It was collateral. The frozen accounts were no longer protective measures. They were leverage. Even the urgency with which he had pushed for settlement made sense now, because delay threatened exposure, and exposure threatened the image he had built so carefully. There was no dramatic confrontation between us, no shouting match, no confession, just paperwork and consequences unfolding at a pace he could no longer control. The court reversed the temporary orders. Access to funds was restored. Custody arrangements were rebalanced. Independent valuation of assets began, and suddenly the numbers Daniel had once dismissed as too complex were laid out plainly, stripped of jargon and narrative, revealing a financial landscape far larger than he had ever acknowledged. He didn't lose everything. People like Daniel rarely do. But he lost the advantage that mattered most to him: control. The settlement came months later, negotiated quietly, without mediation theatrics or courtroom posturing, and when I signed it, I did so without triumph, because victory was never the point. What I felt instead was something steadier, a sense of alignment returning, of standing inside reality again rather than reacting to a version of it someone else had written for me. I did not take revenge. I took what was fair. I bought a modest house, smaller than the one I'd lost, but it felt like mine in a way the old one never had, because ownership is not about square footage, it's about agency. My son's room faced the backyard, and the first night he stayed over, he asked if he could paint the walls, and when I said yes without needing permission from anyone, I felt a quiet, almost unbearable relief. Daniel moved on quickly. He always did. New routines, new explanations, new people who would believe the version of events he offered until experience taught them otherwise. We speak now only when necessary, our conversations limited to logistics and schedules, and in that distance, I have found something unexpected: peace. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how close I came to disappearing quietly, to signing away discovery, to believing that exhaustion was the same thing as acceptance. I think about how easily trust can be used as a tool against the person who offers it most freely. And then I remind myself of something important. I was never powerless. I was simply patient. The truth didn't save me because I chased it recklessly. It surfaced because I waited long enough to let it speak for itself. And if there is a moral in all of this, it isn't about marriage or divorce or money at all. It's this: when someone takes everything from you and tells you it's legal, it's clean, it's final, don't ask first what you've lost. Ask what they needed you not to see.